Good afternoon. My name is James Green. I'm the director of the Brazil Initiative at Brown University, which is an interdisciplinary effort to bring together scholars and students across the disciplines who are interested in working on Brazil or do research in Brazil. And this semester's program is really featuring two issues. One is social equality and justice in Brazil as one of our main themes. And in that regard, today we have the tremendous honor of we've invited and we're to hear Marcia Lima, who is a professor at this Department of Sociology at the University of São Paulo. In this fall semester, she is an Afro-Latin American Research Institute Fellow at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University. She is a senior researcher at SEBRAP, which is a very, very prestigious and important research center, the Brazilian Center for Analysis and Planning in São Paulo, as well as the Center for Metropolitan Studies. She is the editor of the Brazilian Journal of Bibliographic Information on Social Sciences. She has published and supervised students in areas including racial inequality in the labor market and higher education, race and gender inequalities and affirmative action policies in Brazil. And we're really excited today that she's here to be able to present research on the issue of affirmative action in Brazil, its successes and its challenges. And I think as Brazil begins a new phase, political phase with a new government, new politics, new perspectives, the issue of affirmative action and the, I think, significant accomplishments that it has managed to achieve in Brazil are really potentially under threat. And so it's even more important today for us to understand what is being achieved in Brazil and what might be done to expand social inclusion and racial equality in Brazil. So let's give a warm applause to Marcia Lima. So about 35 minutes, and then we'll have questions and answers.
Okay. Thank you, Jamie, for this warm presentation. Thank you for this invitation. For me, it's a great honor to be here. And I consider the current political situation in Brazil, I think it's very important for us talk about Brazil abroad. So thank you so much for this invitation. I'm not sure if the idea to put challenge in my title, it was a good idea, maybe a kind of trip for myself. But at the same time, I think we must talk about challenges, specifically because especially in the research agenda, we need to talk about challenge. So I've been working on racial relations and inequality in Brazil in the last 26 years. So that's the second reason that I decided to deal with the idea of challenge. So I prepared this talk in considering challenges from the three perspectives. The first one is intellectual challenge. Okay? So how race has explained inequalities in Brazil, and how the debate about inequality explains race. Two different questions. Okay? You can consider race as independent variable or race as dependent variable. So I think this question is important because there I perceive a kind of misunderstanding in methodological and analytical question to address race as an issue, intellectual challenge first. The second challenge is race, the debate about race in the public policies, the role of states to face race issues in Brazil. The third challenge is race as a political question. It's about power, it's about visibility, it's about the Black movement agenda, especially to face the racism and the discrimination. That's the second, this challenge, I try to separate the idea of racial inequality and racial discrimination produced. Okay? Why I think this is a challenge? Because race is more than inequality in Brazil. If you consider the black rich people in Brazil, they are free of discrimination. They aren't free of discrimination. They have money, they have status, they have everything, they have education, but they face race discrimination, and prejudice, and especially they face police violence in Brazil. So I'm trying to separate these three different aspects of race in Brazil. Race is more than inequality. I'm not crazy to try to work on these three different questions in 40 minutes. And I haven't worked on all these topics, but I think I have, the last 26 years I've been working on these questions. I have students work on these questions, so I try to resume some points about this question. Today I'm trying to say, when we talk about race in Brazil, we should consider multi-dimension of this issue. So I'm trying to put in this presentation 2 points: racial inequalities and its consequences for the public policies. That's my research agenda, and I'm trying to work on these questions. Okay. So I'm going to talk about the field of studies on race in Brazilian social science. In my previous research, some results of the affirmative action in higher education, especially for the private system. And my new research, I'm working on this same question, but I'm interested in the regional inequalities and race in Brazil. And some final remarks more to debate, okay? The first topic is very interesting. We think about I'm trying to resume 2 points. The question about racial classification, racial identity, is a very important question. It's still a very important question, especially now because you have in Brazil some discussion about the self-classification or classification to public policies. And there is a debate about people who pretend to be black to access policy and how you can deal with this question. And we still work on the idea, the race versus class and the race and class as a question, specifically for the social stratification and the public policies. So I'm going to back to the time, and this picture is about a black movement campaign before the 1990 census, and the idea of don't let your color go blank. It's a jogo de palavras, I don't know, it's a play words. Play words. We have about the census. And this campaign talk about how you can identify black, pardo, and the question in this debate was the proportion of people who declare themselves as black was very, very low in Brazil. And this point, the discussion of this, we had some kind of avoid to be black in Brazil, and they have the discussion about this. And my point is, we can't put in the same discussion race classification and racial identity. And this is very important to understand the affirmative action policy in Brazil. Okay, so we have here the trajectory of racial categories in Brazilian census, and we can see here two important things. In the beginning, the first census in Brazil in 1872, we have a free population and slave population. You have these categories, black and brown. Brown is pardo. The translation is not good, but pardo is the term. And in the first census in Brazil, we had Caboclo, the indigenous and white miscegenation. And after 40s, the category disappeared because the indigenous people disappeared as well in Brazil. And here we have just three categories, white and black. Yellow first because the beginning of immigration in Brazil. And pardo. All other answers were classified as brown, as pardo. So here pardo was a residual category. It's not a main category. And since 50s, you have the same categories, white, black, brown, and yellow. In 1991, the census introduced again the indigenous category. And this introduction, my point of view, I think it's a very political, and we talk about identity. So I think the Brazilian census racial category, we work on more the idea of demography, variable, it's color, than identity. Especially indigenous is the only exception about this category. So the idea, in 2010, they included the indigenous questions about ethnicity and language. So the only group we have a specific discussion about racial identity in Brazilian census is indigenous. So it's very important to understand what we can analyze further this. There is a very interesting research. It's very weird because in Brazilian debate, people don't talk about this research much. It's a very interesting research. There's a survey in 2008. The Brazilian Institute did this survey considering six states in Brazil from different regions, and they tried to understand how these categories work. So they put north, northeast, they cover all regions in Brazil, but why this category works in Brazil? Yeah, is it good? Black, white, brown, yellow. These categories represent the Brazilian diversity. So that's the point of this research. And the results are very, very interesting. So here we're trying to, that's very interesting because their research was in 2008. So the idea was maybe change the racial categories for the census 2010. And they decided to keep the same categories, thanks God. Because I'm going to explain why I think this categories is still working in Brazil. And oops. So the results, some results I select to discuss today. Brazil still, the number of categories was 140 categories of color and race in Brazil. But the results are here. 15 categories included brasileira, mulata, mestiça, alemã, Italian. So, but it's very, very residual. It's not, it doesn't change the main racial categories in Brazil. So if you consider this, the second, so these categories is like order, is less than 5% of the discussion. Here we have the 7 categories about racial classification in Brazil. And from the 7 categories, just only 2 is not in the census, the Brazilian census. So to be morena and to be negra. Negra is a political category for the black and brown people. So here you have the reason. If using the same census categories, you have 65% of the survey. All census categories plus negra. There is no doubt about negra, so you decide to say, I'm negra, I'm black, yeah, I'm like political recognition about to be black. And census categories plus negra plus moreno, 95%. So the only misunderstanding about categories you have in Brazil is about moreno, the 20% of the population. So this survey is very representative. They select different places in Brazil, consider the proportion of black and white people in these states. So Brazilian databases are very, very reliable. I think the quality of the surveys in Brazil is very good. So I'm trying to address here that we have a racial classification more than racial identity in this information. So you can talk about black and white and black, pardo, and preto in Brazil. White is, there is no misunderstanding to be white in Brazil, I think. And the next point, but how people decide this? That's the question. So they ask people, which dimensions have you considered to define your race or color? And there's a multiple response answers. So there is not. The most frequent are skin color, so, family origin, that's the same, the Afro-descendants, and physical features. So it's completely phenotypical description about themselves. And this question is very interesting. Does race color influence the people's life? The answer was 64% declare yes. And which relations does race influence the people's life? Again, multiple response. Labor market, policy, and socializing. Socialize is not a good answer. I didn't put this, I wouldn't put this question because socialize is everything. But you can consider the first two more frequent answers about labor market and policy. So the relationship with the policeman, the police violence in Brazil is a very, very serious situation, and the area around race influence the people's life in Brazil. And I back to this question here, does race color influence your people's life? And I look at the answer considering the regional information. My concern now, I've been working on the idea of we can't understand more than Brazilian racial inequalities without look at the regional organization in Brazil. So it's, for me now, I'm working on the importance of to understand different regions in Brazil to different approach about race. So it's very, very interesting, this result. Why? Because the 77% of people in Distrito Federal say, yes, thus race is important to define the lives of people. And São Paulo, Paraíba, Mato Grosso, Rio Grande, that's, I put in this, it's the total of the population. Why this? I have two explanations for this. The first one is demographic explanation. When you have more diversity or more black people, like the Distrito Federal, 40% declare themselves like negro, pardo, e preto. And the level of education, the population in Distrito Federal is higher than the Brazil because of the public services, because of the Brazilian. Mato Grosso e Amazonas, people who declare themselves as moreno consider race less important to explain their lives. And Rio Grande do Sul, most of the people are white, so that's the reason they don't consider you to be race as important to explain this. What about São Paulo? São Paulo is interesting because 25% of the population declare themselves like pardo, preto, and negro. But São Paulo is a very, very competitive space and very segregated space as well. If you look at the distribution of black population in São Paulo, the segregation is very, very high. So I think that's the other reason to understand why you have so different regional approaches to understand the idea that race is important or not to understand what's happening in the people's life, considering race. So I try to address here, so race matter for the life of people, and we have very, very different regional approach to understand race in Brazil. And nowadays, that's the Brazilian classification. The question is, which is your color or race? Since the census exists, that's the question. Which is your color or race? We always use both color and race, color or race, to the kind of pick up what if you are, it's the race, okay, it's the color, okay, just select one of them to describe themselves. And we have worked on the idea, that's the distribution. And here it is important to talk about to be black. So the discussion about to be black and white is why you use black as a category, and black plus brown is black. Because Nelson do Vale Silva did very, very important studies about the idea to be no white in Brazil. So in this research, black and browns show a similar performance related to their socioeconomic profile on the statistics. So if you look at the educational attainment for black and brown, the unemployment rates for black and brown, they are very, very similar. So that's the idea. They put together black and brown. You talk about black population in Brazil. But if you look at these categories, considering regional approach is different. So that's the scenario. That's when we talk about Brazil, when we talk about race in Brazil, that's the information we have, the last Brazilian census. And the idea to be black or no white came from these studies. And since 2007, Brazil has more black people than white, little more, but more black, more no white people. Since the PNAD 2007 was the first year we collect information about race, and white people is not majority anymore. So I think this if you look at the growth rate of the population, the growth rate of these categories, you have certainly reclassification. It's impossible. Change this because of people who declare white before change to pardo, maybe. Or pardo may change to black. And the number of the indigenous people in Brazil has increased a lot as well. Because the census, since the census of 19 census, changed these categories, and now you have more people identify themselves as indigenous as well. This is because the policies, I don't know. Nobody knows. You can affirm this. Okay? So I try to, this is a very important question to understand the dynamic of racial inequality in Brazil and the dynamic of public policies for race in Brazil. So you can identify black people in Brazil. We can produce policies against racial inequality in Brazil because people know who's black and white in Brazil. It's a very important point to stress in this presentation, in this debate. The second point is very important to understand the racial inequalities in Brazil, is the discussion about race and class. So we still work on this discussion. And we have the major interpretative discussions about race in Brazil, how you can understand, how you can explain the situation of black people in Brazil. So the most traditional explanation, this is not news for anyone, but we have to back in this discussion, because when Brazilians started the debate about affirmative action, all this discussion emerged again. So who's black and white? This discussion back. It's not class, it's race. It's not race, it's class. This debate. We had to visit this discussion again. So you can consider the first interpretation about Brazil. It's the studies from 30s and 40s in Brazil, and the discussion, no, the worst situation for the black people is because of the slavery. And very interesting, because people still use this discussion until today, because the history, it's a history. It's not about the present, it's about the past. So reference to the past to explain black situation, economic situation in Brazil is still working. And the second, racial prejudice is a hangover of slavery. So slavery still work on this discussion. Projeto UNESCO is a very famous project who discussed this debate about race and class. And racial prejudice is incompatible with development of the class society. Florestan Fernandes' argument, it's a very, very important and powerful argument. The racial prejudice will disappear because we can live with the racial prejudice in the class society. So it's the second and famous explanation about race, and very, very strong argument against racial policy in Brazil. It's still working yet. The third one is Carlos Rosenbaum's approach about how the racial discrimination is a mechanism to lead to the inequality in Brazil, put black out from the competition, and preserve privilege for the white people. So this Carlos Rosenbaum thesis was the most important work to trying to change the view about racial inequality in Brazil, because he elaborated a theory considering the relationship between discrimination and inequality. Racial discrimination produces racial inequality. So we still work on this question, yeah. And I put another interpretation at how race works on the mark of class. And here I think I remember the Max Weber discussion about class statement and the idea of honor. So it's a kind of status, prestigious. It's not on about, it's symbolic. The way that race works in Brazil, it's a kind of representation of class. So if you are black, you are poor. In my PhD dissertation, I worked on this idea, and the title of my dissertation is Serviço de Branco, Serviço de Preto. So you have a connection and careers and color in Brazil. So, but it's not only about the status. For example, you can be a very, very rich black person if you are a musician, if you are artist, if you are football player. But you can't be black and rich if you are lawyer. Or at the same time, you can work on some occupations, even in the low positions, if you are black. For example, you have to deal with public. So in Brazil, when I did this dissertation, I interviewed a waiter. So you have to, in Brazil, if you're looking for a black waiter in the most rich areas in Brazil, you can't find. Go to Leblon or Jardins, São Paulo, and looking for a black waiter serving in a good restaurant. It's almost impossible. So it's not only status. There are more than money and status in this relationship between work and color in Brazil. That's the discussion I did in my dissertation, in my PhD dissertation. And we have this relation and the phenotypic characteristic and the hierarchy in Brazil. So race is a mark of class. Race defines the perception of class in Brazil. So you have a kind of representation, social representation, to be black and white, and the position you can take in the social structure in Brazil. So consider these questions. I've been working the last 5 or more years, last 5 years, I've been working on how these questions appear in the debate about policies in Brazil. How we can work on the idea to create policies for black people in Brazil, considering all these challenges. Who is black and white in Brazil? Race or class? So how we can organize a policies for black people in Brazil, considering this for the first part of this presentation. So I don't know how familiar you are the process in affirmative action in Brazil, but I have a very, very short timeline to explain what's happened. 2001, the first university in Brazil to adopt the affirmative action policy was the State University of Rio de Janeiro, from a law state, from government. So it's not about the federal. From 2002 to 2012, several higher education institutions in Brazil, federal institutions, state institutions, adopt social quotas and racial quotas. Just few universities in Brazil use only racial quotas. This is very, very important. We don't have in Brazil a racial quota system. Our system is social and racial system. And 2007, you have the I think the most important process in Brazil was Reúne. The expansion of the system was very, very important. It's a kind of affirmative action. So the expansion of the higher education system in Brazil was very important to change the Brazilian scenario in terms of access to higher education. Only in 2012, the Supreme Court decided, okay, affirmative action is constitutional. But this debate is about the federal institutions and federal programs. So state universities and private universities continuously decide by themselves who adopt or don't adopt this policy. So you don't have, nothing is compulsory for the state university, neither the private institution. Private institution can adopt ProUni, University for All, or don't apply. It's a decision. And you have the law in August 2012. Only in 2012, we approved the law about quotas in Brazil. This is the law. It's a very important because people don't know about it. Okay, if you have 100 vacancies, how you can distribute this? 50% open competition, if 50% reserved to students who attend high school and public schools. So the first criteria is full high school in public institutions. Besides this, we have two steps. The first one is income, the poorest people, and family with more than 1.5 minimum wage per capita if students from family income lower than 1.5 minimum wage per capita. After that, we apply a proportion of black and brown indigenous. We talk PPI, preto, pardos, indígenas, and the other students, the white students. In the same for the people, so students from families income above 1.5 minimum wage, proportion of the black and brown indigenous, and the other students. How do they define this disproportion? Oops. Okay. The proportion of black and brown indigenous according to the proportion in each state. So, for example, São Paulo State, we have 25% of the population as black and Prado. You have 25% of the vacancies for these students. So, it's very, very important to consider each steps. You don't have racial quotas in Brazil. We have a social racial quota system in Brazil. Consider the private institution. This is my last big research. I'm finished this book about ProUni. And ProUni, University for All, was the biggest program in Brazil to access higher education. Since 2005, more than 1 million scholarships in our country. So ProUni was the first federal program as well. And the idea of this program is easy. They promote exchange of scholarships in private higher education by exemption of federal tax. So institutions who adopt ProUni doesn't have to pay money for tax for the government. They never pay this tax, so that's the only point. They never pay this tax. So you can't concentrate, I am going to put all my scholarships in pedagogy, education, or social science. No. They have to, the number of scholarships are regulated by law and correspond approximately 10% of the number of its regular pay students. And they can distribute this scholarship considering the structure of the institution. So if they have engineering, law, education, they have to put scholarships in all these courses. They can't put to our shocks. They did it before. Before the ProUni, institutions who had exemption, they did this, put all this scholarship in the lowest prestigious course they have. After this law, they couldn't do this. And my research questions were, who's taking advantage of the expansion of higher education? Does participation in higher education changed in general in black and poor people? What's happened for black and poor people after this expansion and affirmative action program? I've been working on two ideas about the inclusion and diversion. Yeah, you have the results of my research were the careers is very, very important to define what kind of inclusion we can get with affirmative action in a private system. So you can consider the positive way to look at this is expansion reflects inclusion. Everybody go to the university, it's much better now, it's great. or higher education expenses are kind of diversion. I'm going to show you what's this idea. So the positive way to understand the expansion and affirmative action. Higher education, so even the poorest students have a chance in the top tier of the universities. The result of my research showed that only the students get enrolled in the few and good private institutions. So if you got ProUni scholarship and go to the best private university in Brazil, yes, it's a great way to do inclusion. But most of the best private institutions in Brazil haven't joined the ProUni. Especially in São Paulo, the best private institution in São Paulo didn't adopt the ProUni. And there is a stratification of higher education in Brazil, considering the history of his family condition is a very important question. I interviewed several students about it, and the importance of family is change everything. Family condition, place of residence, because São Paulo is a very segregated place, so the mobility in São Paulo is very, very hard. So depends on you live, it depends on your work, you can access a better or worse institutions. It's full or partial tuition. That's a very certification inside the system. And the quality of high school. So if you have a good high school, if you have a family supporting you, if you live in the certain part of the city, ProUni was good. They could access the best universities, they could access the best courses, best careers, and ProUni worked for these people. The second tier, the university is not good, the career is not good, change the opportunity. Again, the career define everything about. So if you're going to do engineer in the low prestigious university, it's okay, you can change your life. But if you attend a law school in the less prestigious institution, nothing has changed for you. And you still unemployment, you still work on different job. Nothing changed. And the idea of higher education as a diversion. So again, we back to the idea of displaced diversion, a working class to the second tier. It's very, very important, the discussion. What's happened with the expansion in Brazil? The expansion changed the system or put more the same in the system? So the effect of higher education degree for undergraduate in the labor market remains important in Brazil. So if you go to the school, it's still being better to improve your wage, improve your labor market. Most of my interviews, they have, they change their jobs after access to university because they changed the network. The social network is very, very important. So sometimes they went to a law school, it's a not good university, a not good institution, but they knew some people and they could access another job. They knew different things in the city. They had a new network, social network. I think we work more in the idea of social capital to understand race in Brazil. Nobody talks about social capital to understand race. It's very important. At the Metropolitan Studies Center, we have a colleague, Eduardo Marques. He worked on the idea of the network and poverty in Brazil. It's the same for the racial question. So your network is very, very important to change your life. So the idea of social capital to understand the race is very interesting. And that's the the resume of that's this research I've been working in. I finished this research about the ProUni, and I'm trying to work on the same idea, but I'm trying to look at the changes in the regional research. Before I address this question, let me talk my time. Let me see. Ooh, I have. Okay, this is the scenario. Okay, what's happening in Brazil? I'm working in a project with Professor Marta Hatch about the trajectory of inequalities in Brazil, and we work. What I wrote a chapter about the racial inequality in the last 50 years in Brazil. What's happened? We have here elementary school in Brazil from the 80s to 2010 disappeared. It's completely universal, the access to elementary school. High school has increased a lot, but still, but you have racial inequality, yes, yet. And the higher education. This is the net attendance rates for. The most interesting question I always address this question is this. Okay? In the 80s, in the 90s, nobody attended higher education in Brazil. When they started, the system was very, very, very close for everyone. So that's the same here. Just in the ends of the 90s, we have the access to high school in Brazil. We talk about high school. So when we discuss the idea of inequality in Brazil and the idea of inclusion in Brazil, that's the challenge I was talking about, the system was very, very, very closed. The level of inequality is high in Brazil. So we start a process. We started a process in Brazil, but we need keep going on these policies for a long, long, long time. But the beginning, this is less than 10% of the population, the 80s in Brazil, access to higher education. So we start in the level of inequality in Brazil. It's a huge challenge to change something. I have to run. Don't have time for this. So the idea of two system, I told about this public and private institution. And I'm going to show you what I'm talking about when I talk about this stratification. So I consider two different levels for institutions in Brazil. The first level, most of them are universities. We have more universities than colleges and isolated faculties. Isolated faculties is a faculdade de pedagogia, faculdade de direito, the small college. And you can see the difference between the first tier and the second tier. So most of the quality of the system is university, and the qualification of the teaching staff is very, very different. The first tier, you have most of the professors have PhD, and the second tier, the proportion of PhD is very, very low. So that's the idea I'm work on to understand the stratification of higher education, the horizontal stratification in Brazil, okay? That's the same for the regime, the work regime for the staff, full-time regime for the first year, and our base is the most important regime in the second tier of the universities, of the higher education. And this is very interesting to understand inequality, racial inequality in Brazil. The period of attendance. So the second tier is a day class, and the first tier is a day class, and the second tier is a night class. So this described describe a very specific inequality. It's not about race inequality, but who can attend the day class? Who needs the night class, the evening class? So it's very, very important to understand how the system is unequal. It's not about the inequality among people. That inequality affects the system, how the system is unequal, how the policies are unequal. So we can put this element in our analysis to understand what's happening in Brazil. I don't have time to address this. So I've been working my new research is about the same question, work on regional features. So considering the inequality, regional inequalities in Brazil, I'm going to work on this census, higher education census, and PNAD, National Household Census. I consider this timeline because in 1995, we started the expansion of higher education. 2005, we have the ProUni system. 2007, the support for the ReUni. And the law, I finished my analysis in this period. I'm going to send you some information about racial inequality and distribution in Brazil. This is how white people are distributed in Brazil. If you consider this, they concentrate in the south and southeast. Here you have pardos, brown. And here you have black people in Brazil. So you can be these areas like the most black people here. You can see the south in Brazil. In some areas here, we have the proportion of the black people. So I'm looking at this because I believe you can understand this distribution to understand what's happening in Brazil in terms of policies. So I need to finish my presentation and talk too much. I'm trying to put together the demographic questions about the distribution of race in Brazil, the distribution of the system, the higher education system. So you can see here how the system is distributed in Brazil, the Midwest, South, Southeast. So most of our university in Brazil on the Southeast, and Northeast, 18%, South, and the public and private system, the distribution of the public and private system as well. The private system in Southeast is the best private system you have in Brazil, of course. São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Minas Gerais. These states have the best private institutions in Brazil. So that's the reason they have they have money to pay as well. So that's the reason. So I'm going to work on this expansion. I'm going to show you what's happening in Brazil. This is Brazilian scenario for public university in 2000. Most of this institutions were in the capital, in the central. What's happened in 2012? That's the scenario of the expansion. So we have more countryside universities and the expansion of the system. That's the reason the proportion of the participation of the black people in Brazil has increased a lot. It's not only about affirmative action policy, it's about expansion of the system. And you can see in the Northeast and North, this is very interesting because here there is nothing. And they change a lot. So it's very important to understand the Brazilian society look at the expansion of that system. I'm going to finish. I don't want to.
We won't have time for question and answers.
Yeah. Okay. My next step is understand that my last PowerPoint is this. my next step let me work on this now this semester. Who eligible for the higher education in Brazil? So, because it's a very, very curious, because this are people who enroll in the last year of the high school in Brazil. That's the total of the population, and considering the different region. But look at just it. So in the 90s, you have the explosion of higher education that literature says, the boom of high school in Brazil, not higher education. But what's happened here? Of course, there are distance between, the distance is not equal. But we have a question here. The demand of higher education is diminished in Brazil. So you have to invest in high school to create demand for the higher education. Because when we start this policy, we had a lot of people with high school without access to higher education. And now the flow is changing. So we need to look at what's happening in the high school in Brazil to understand the effect of the high school to higher education. So, and here you have to face the debate about racial inequality. So I've been working this idea, and I'd like to finish, consider the discussion of the trajectory of inequality. This book is a very interesting book, coming in English next year. Policies and democracy matter. And the displacement in equal partnership require policies requirements for a long period of time. So without democracy, without policies, we can't change the Brazilian reality about inequalities. And you need the long period, long-term policies to change something in Brazil. I'm sorry if I talked too much. Thank you.
Some people have to leave to go to class, we have classes,
Okay,
but we should certainly
sorry.
ask questions. Maybe take a round of 3 or 4 people who want to ask questions, and then you can answer them as a block, and then we can have more time afterward informally. Yeah, you.
Oh, it's me, okay. I came a little late, so I might have missed it, but I was wondering if you could, should I introduce myself?
Sure.
I mean, I'm Esther Kurtz, I'm working in ethnomusicology in Bahia, studying Capoeira Angola.
Oh,
I wonder if you could expand on the top question a little bit more. I'm just trying to get a bigger picture of what the impact has been in Black communities. If there's a sense that there is more opportunity, or more people are entering the university. I mean, that's the impression I got in Feira de Santana, that there's some of these new universities there, and you go and it's at least, you know, it's dominantly Afro-Brazilian,
Yeah.
and there's a sense of like the newness of that opportunity. But I just wonder if you could talk to the bigger picture.
okay.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I learned a lot, and you know that I know a little about this. I learned a lot today, but I wonder if there is difference, difference if you look at the gender perspective, how women and Black women are entering and think about the system and the gender perspective, and also this expansion of the public system. If there is a difference between universities in the capitals and in terms of structure, and also the professors, how it's different between the new universities and the older universities.
Okay. 3 questions. Okay, more. I'm I'm going to answer this and another one, okay? About the perception, that's a huge debate, a very interesting debate in Brazil. I work on this in qualitative approach in my research. And I interviewed people in São Paulo city. It's a very different situation considered but the two points were very important for the students. The teachers in the high school, and when the ProUni started, people didn't believe. No, it's not possible. I can access a university, I don't have to pay nothing, because before the ProUni, we still have the FIEs, the financial aid, but they have to pay after when you finish the college. So the perspective, the first one is it's not possible, but they have the perspective of the opportunity, and they took this seriously, and most of the ProUni students in São Paulo, they have more, the grades, they are more, the achievement is better than the no ProUni students, because ProUni has, you have to they evaluate your aproveitamento escolar.
Curriculum.
You can fail, for example. You can fail. You can keep some kind of grade to keep the scholarship, for example. So it's very, very different for the. So they have the perception of the opportunity they have, and it's weird because if you look at the last election in Brazil, the major election in São Paulo, sometimes I think they don't realize what's important, what's happening in Brazil. I think they don't realize they can lose this, in my opinion. But they have a great view about the opportunity, about the possibility, but the career is very important, as I said, because if you are a good course in a good university, okay, you are more positive about the program. But if you fail, or if you go to a less prestigious course, they don't have the same perspective about the changing. It uses gender. Yes, I have a lot of information about gender, but I think that's a specific investigation. But I can tell you, black male in Brazil, like here in USA, is in a very critical situation. So most of the discussion is about black women. Black women has increased much more her participation in the higher education than black men, especially because black men fail before. They didn't finish the high school, for example. It's a very, very serious situation for the black male in Brazil. The black male, it's a critical situation for. And I put this because it's very interesting how the careers in Brazil are very, very. The participation of the women in the career is bigger because of the career as well. So you can be, the careers in the north, northeast, and most of the career are education, social sciences, and they are female careers. So that's the point. The new institutions, you're right. For example, the new federal universities have different conditions in terms of I think not about the salary, the wage, neither the qualification, but they have to work more, they have more classes, they have more time in class than us. Mm-hmm. We have more time for research, we have more time for research, we have less class than the new generation. Probably you work more than I. When you get your, if you get a place in the public university in Brazil today, you have more class to teach than we have now. I think that's the difference, because they have more students. And I think that's the specific changing about, but about the qualification. The PhD is still PhD, full-time. Full-time, there is a big discussion about full-time in Brazil as well. But I think you can keep this full-time and qualification won't change in the short time. Okay.
Thank you so much for this talk. It was wonderful. My name is Wachifani Poe. I'm a second-year PhD student in Africana Studies, and I look at Black, gay, lesbian, and transgender social and political movements in Brazil and the United States. And a lot of the things that you were saying, I was just doing research over the summer. When I was interviewing folks, these things definitely came up in terms of thinking about the realities of affirmative action, how they're seeing these things changing the demographics of their universities. And so it was absolutely great to hear your talk. My question is, I have two questions, and one of them is looking at the changing in racial classifications for folks. So you talked about how the affirmative action system is linked to demographic populations in certain areas, racial demographic information. And so I'm wondering, and I'm thinking about the first picture you showed about the Black movement saying, "Don't let your color go blank." And I'm wondering if movements are organizing consciousness around folks to understand that if our racial classification is connected to then what affirmative action policies and quotas are going to be, is there organizing around that to then have folks maybe think differently about their racial classifications so that they can reap benefits from the state, and thinking about from affirmative action policies. So that's one question. And then I'm also wondering if there are any programs around retention in the universities for Black and brown students, and students specifically coming from affirmative action programs.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you again for your presentation. My name is Camila, and I wanted to go back a little bit to the beginning of your talk when you were saying that there was a change in the percentage of demographics, so there was an increase in Black populations at some point. And you said that was related to people recognizing themselves more and more as Black people. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the transition to that change and like the affirmation of Black identity in general.
Thanks too.
Yeah, my name is Brother Robert Hazard. In Spanish, I'm a hermano La Salle. I don't know how to say it in Portuguese.
You're a LaSalle brother. Oh, and irmão da Ordem LaSalle.
Okay.
And I'm wondering, I know we have some schools in Brazil, and I'm wondering, but more generally, I'm wondering the religious institutions that exist, educational institutions, what role they play in all this.
Okay, thank you. Jim?
So that last map of the universities, I think, said so much about the new universities that were built and the importance of that. So recognizing all of the very progressive advances of the last 13 years that probably will be dismantled, many of them. Still, what is striking about the educational policies was the emphasis on private institutions as the main vehicle to expand the educational opportunities by giving benefits to the expansion of private universities, huge business profit private universities, not like the Catholic university, but real profit. And the way that is the core part of the ways in which these opportunities have expanded, and the quality is so much less in these schools, and huge class sizes, teachers paid very poorly, they're doing no research, they're just teaching. And so, to what extent, I guess I want you to kind of reflect on that since you're working in the private university system. To what extent something very progressive was undermined by, at the same time, a strategy that was really to accommodate to market capitalism in a very profound way, finance market capitalism, which is one of the best ways you can make money in Brazil is stock market, private university, as I understand it.
Wow, nice questions. Thank you. I think we have the same question about racial identity and racial. This campaign, don't let your color go blank, was in 1992, before the 1991 census. So, before the debate about affirmative action, I think we don't have the connection between the increase of this population and the affirmative action policies. I think we can correlate this movement, but I think Brazil has experienced some kind of change in the racial identity, as, for example, to be, say, I'm negro. It's new. This data from the research 2008, if you compare the last research, the other research in 1976 about, nobody in the 70s said I'm negro in Brazil. So there is a political perspective about to be black in Brazil. And I think the black movement was very important for this construction. I think black movement has been working a lot to construct the idea of to be black in Brazil. And the other question is how you can deal with these categories when you construct policies. So my point is, this is the price of the policy. We can't ask someone to define yourself as a black or white. So we had a discussion in Brazil because a white guy applied to a diplomacy course.
The School of
Yes, School of Diplomacy, and he said, I'm black because my grandmother is black. And people, it was a huge discussion, including among the black movement. He can't do that. He can't do that. It's moral. it's about morals, about rules, principle, but nobody can't say for them you are not black. Nobody can't say for them you can't apply for quota, racial quota. We can't do that. That's the price when you decided to create this kind of policies. It's the same price you pay for a cash transfer program, the same price you have to pay for a ProUni. People lie about your income to get some benefits. The race must be the same. You can't try the another way. So that's the reason I put this in discussion again, because that's the price of this kind of policy. So because you can't, it's a very, very trip. It's a trap. It's a trap when you're trying to change the self-classification to discuss policy. It's a very, very, very trap for the black movement, for the black people in Brazil. So I think they have connection, but the connection is not the opportunity to be black. I don't believe this. I think this case like this guy is very, very rare. It's isolated situation, and forget it, move on, But I think we have more conscience about to be black in Brazil. Black consciousness in Brazil has changed a lot, and you can perceive this in the demographic information about to be black and to be white. So, if you look at the data about this data. Oops. This. So, Distrito Federal, 29% of people declare themselves as negro in Brazil. It's amazing. It's a huge transformation about the idea of to be black and white in Brazil. There is a change. There is a change about to recognize themselves like black, white, pardo. And pardo is a very interesting category because it's a native category. Everybody uses Pardo. It's spontaneous. I'm Pardo. But people say Pardo in the census can be I'm negro in the everyday life. In the everyday life, nobody I'm Pardo. I'm negro. But when you have to declare in the census, I'm Pardo. And there was a political decision to be black. I declare myself preta. No, you're not preta. I'm preta. So I declare myself black in this. When I ask you to answer this question, which color? Preta. Oh. So you have this small movements about the political movement to recognize ourselves like black people. So I think that's the connection. About the religions, they have a very, very important, the religion institution in higher education in Brazil, they had a very, very important role in the construction of higher education system in Brazil. The Catholic system, Pontifícia Universidades Catholic University in Brazil, is huge. They have a huge participation in the system, and before the affirmative action, the first affirmative action in Brazil started in the Católicas, and the Catholic universities in Brazil. The PUC system, they adopted the affirmative action in the 80s in Brazil by Frei Davi, who worked on this for a long, long time. So they have a very, they are a very, very important player in this discussion in Brazil. Jimmy, state in Brazil, if you look at the labor market in Brazil, who the most important employer of people from higher education in Brazil is the state. So the state regulates the law, they hire it, and they regulate everything. So people talk about the liberal in Brazil is a very, very, the liberal policies in Brazil needs to Brazilian state money. So most of this private institution in Brazil receive a lot of money from the government before the ProUni, and still receive money from Brazilian government. I interviewed Fernando Haddad for my research, because Fernando Haddad was responsible for the ProUni process. He created the ProUni when he was Minister of Education in Brazil. And he told me, Marcia, I just put I put the same money we had before in another way. The same money. There's not more money than government. ProUni, people before ProUni, for example, you have an odontology course in your university. You offer free access for 10 people. That's your contribution to be a no-profit institution. Fernando Haddad put all these contrapartida.
These their own part, what they'd have to put into it.
So before ProUni, this budget from private institution, they decide how they can use this idea to be profity. And Fernando Haddad decides, no, if you want to be profity, you have to give scholarship.
I mean non-profit.
In non-profit. In non-profit, sorry. And if you are profit and ask for some discount or tax exemption, you have to give scholarship. So all social work in the universities now is by scholarship. Before, they decide how, and now the minister decide how. So that's the very, very important change. And about the quality, I think ProUni can be, it's not, but can be the best evaluation of the quality of private university, because if they if they had a serious evaluation of the institution who apply to ProUni, consider the quality, they can improve quality in the system by this policy. For if your grade is less than 3, you can't receive ProUni. But the problem is, if you have a grade below than 3, you maybe 2-3 years to lose the. So they should be more effective in this evaluation of the quality of the institution. So, yeah, I think the ProUni has increased in the north and northeastern Brazil. No, the private institution has increased in north and northeastern Brazil because of the ProUni. We have new higher education institutions created because of the ProUni, because of the exemption. So they have power to change the quality, I think.
But unfortunately,
Okay.
we have to end